Down there, life continues. The traffic is awful, stocks go on trading, and Star Trek is still showing.
Good day, grade 8 learners. Welcome to today's Natural Sciences lesson. My name is Patho Chetso and this lesson is proudly brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education. In today's lesson, we are going to be learning under the knowledge area Life and Living. Topic is interactions and interdependence within the environment, and the subtopic, which is our main area of focus today, is balance in ecosystems. Balance in ecosystems. Now let's go through the lesson objectives together. These are the goals we want to achieve today. So at the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe a balanced ecosystem, define the factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem, and list the natural and human factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem, and as well as discuss the natural and human factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem. All this is sourced from your CAPS document on page 38. On page 38. Now let's go through our pre-knowledge. In grade 5 and 6, we learned about the concept of an ecosystem and feeding relationships. So far, we've been learning about photosynthesis and respiration. We've also learned about ecosystem and what makes up an ecosystem. We also learned about feeding relationships. If you remember, we learned about energy flow, food chains, and food webs. We also learned about energy flow. Now, let's move on to the baseline activity. So I'm going to read the questions and then give you time to answer them. Number 1, use the diagram below to answer the following questions. So you're going to refer to the diagram. Question 1A, what can we call this diagram? Question 1B, which organism is the producer? Question 1C, which organisms are the consumers? Take 3 minutes to answer these questions. Then after 3 minutes, we will look at the solutions together. Do not forget to send in your answers and any questions you may have to our WhatsApp number at the bottom of the screen. I'll just read it out for you. It's 079 578 2908. So see you after 3 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Now let's go through the questions together. So you needed to use the diagram below to answer the questions that followed. 1a, what can we call this diagram? What can we call this diagram? It is called a food web. So if you wrote food web, you got it correct. And which organism is the producer? So what do you know about producers? What makes producers special is that they make their own food. So when we look at this diagram here of all the organisms that are here in this food web, which organism makes its food? Which organism makes its food? It is the grass. The grass makes its food. The grass makes its own food, so it is the grass. And which organisms are the consumers? Which organisms are the consumers? So the consumers cannot make their own food. They cannot make their own food, so they rely on the producers for food. And which organisms here are the consumers that are consuming either the producers or other consumers as well? So here are the consumers. We've got the locust, we've got the scorpion, we've got the baboon, the leopard, and the impala. So this arrow should face that direction. Okay, so the consumers are the locust, the scorpion, the baboon, and the leopard, as well as the impala. Okay, so now take 1 minute to copy down the corrections, and then we'll continue with our lesson thereafter. Welcome back. I hope you've copied down the corrections. Now let's move on to terminology. So the first term is population. The first term is population. The first term is pollution. The first term is pollution. Right, what does this term mean? So pollution is harm done to the environment by the release of harmful materials and substances usually produced by human activity. So that's what pollution means, harm that is done to the environment. Okay, now pollutants. These are chemicals or wastes that contaminate the water, the air, and or the soil. And fossil fuels, these are energy containing compounds such as coal, oil, or natural gases. And then poaching, this is illegally removing animals or plants from the wild. Illegally removing animals or plants from the wild. Now, what do we mean by balance in an ecosystem? Now let's dive deeper into today's subtopic. Now the plants and animals in ecosystems, we already know that they have relationships. There's an interdependence that exists between plants and animals. So they depend on each other in order to survive. Right. They also depend on the non-living factors as well. Now, interruptions to an ecosystem, remember, it has got non-living factors and living factors. The non-living components, which is your sun, your soil, your air, and the living components, which consist of your plants and animals. So any interruption to an ecosystem can be very disruptive to all the organisms that we find in it. So we require a balance. So there has to be a balance that is maintained in an ecosystem. This balance in an ecosystem, when it contains organisms, that the organisms need food from that ecosystem, they need water, and they also need shelter from that ecosystem. So there has to be a balance between the organisms, the living organisms, and the non-living parts that are in an ecosystem. So for the survival of the living organisms in that ecosystem, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be a balance. Now, over time, populations interact and change within a community, and which means that they grow. Populations reproduce, and new offspring are born into the population. New offspring are born into the population, and the species in the wild grows. Now, we can't have populations being too many, so there has to be a balance. Remember, there is that aspect. Now, living organisms need food, living organisms need water, and living organisms need food. So there has to be a balance. Now, that balance is kept by a number of different factors. This is because an ecosystem can only accommodate as many organisms as its resources. What are these resources? These resources are food. These resources are water. These resources are mating partners. For organisms or for populations to increase, they have to have mating partners and also habitats. These organisms have to have a shelter. So for there to be a balance, and an ecosystem can only accommodate as much populations or as much communities as it can carry for it to remain in balance, Now, we all know the main goal of any species, be it the humans, cattle, or any other animals. The main goal is to reproduce and to make sure that the species survive, so to ensure the survival of the species. Now, there are some factors, and these factors are beyond the control of the species, and they can often influence the survival of the species or limit the growth of the population. So these factors can either influence the survival. Does the species become extinct? Does the species continue living? And how many or how big is the population of this particular species? So it is often because of factors beyond the control of the particular species. And some of these factors could be due to, we're going to discuss them later, they could be due to their natural factors or human factors. Now, such disruptions can cause an imbalance in the ecosystem. Remember, for an ecosystem to be balanced, there has to be enough food to support the populations and the community, enough food, enough water, and enough shelter. Now, factors that are beyond the control of the species can disrupt the balance, and they cause an imbalance to the ecosystem, thereby affecting the organisms that live there, as well as the ecosystem as a whole, leading to the loss of populations, the reduction of populations, and dying of animals, Now, an ecosystem provides these resources. Let's say them again: food, water, light, and shelter. So an ecosystem, so if you look at this, an ecosystem provides all these resources. But if the supply is limited, but the supply is usually limited, like a water source in the savanna climate, water is usually limited. So the supply is limited. Therefore, the plants and animals compete with each other for these resources. Remember when we were learning about feeding relationships and how one is called competition, where if there is a limited resource, organisms often, or different populations within a community, often compete for that one limited resource. They compete for that one limited resource. For example, one ecosystem is the Congo rainforest. The Congo rainforest is very, very rich in biodiversity, which means it has different species, all kinds of living organisms are found in the Congo rainforest. Now, the Congo rainforest boasts of its population in teak trees. So it has a lot of teak trees. And with this huge population of teak trees, only 1% of the sunlight reaches the ground in some parts of the rainforest. So let's talk about light, a resource that an ecosystem is supposed to provide. So all these trees in the Congo rainforest are competing for light because only 1% of the light reaches the ground, which means the taller trees are covering, are creating shade for the shorter trees. So there is a competition for survival for light in the Congo rainforest. So which means now because light is limited, which means the plants in the Congo need to compete for that light. They need to compete for that light to ensure that their species doesn't die off, to ensure that their species doesn't become extinct. Okay. Now, so all living organisms that are in an ecosystem, they interact with each other, they depend with each other, and these interactions may include competition, they prey on each other. So all living organisms within an ecosystem, they interact with each other. So what happens to one population will affect the whole community. So whatever is going to happen to one population is going to affect the entire community. So with that in mind, what do you think would happen if the producers died suddenly? Let's say we have an ecosystem and the producers died suddenly. What do you think would happen? Right. Fact number one, producers, they make their own food, and these producers are the food source for your herbivores, your primary consumers. And the herbivores are food for the secondary consumers, and the secondary consumers are food for the tertiary consumers, which means the whole food chains and food webs will be affected, which means if the producers were to all die suddenly, there's going to be an imbalance. There's going to be an imbalance in the ecosystem. That particular ecosystem is going to have an imbalance because now it would have lost one of its important members, producers that play an important role in the food chains, in the food webs of ecosystems. So all the other animals are going to be affected as well because they won't have a food source, the ones that it produces and the ones that are consumed by the animals that don't eat the producers are going to be affected as well. So there's going to be an imbalance in that ecosystem. Now, what do we mean by balance in an ecosystem? So the number of animals an ecosystem can support for long periods. So that is the balance. It is the number of animals that an ecosystem can support for long periods. So does that ecosystem have enough food? Does it have enough light? Does it have enough water, and does it have enough habitats? So all these factors contribute to the balance of an ecosystem. How well can an ecosystem support a certain number of animals over a long period of time? Now, the balance of an ecosystem can be disrupted by the following: one, natural factors, and two, human factors. These two can affect the balance of an ecosystem. They can affect how many organisms or how many animals, plants and animals, an ecosystem is able to support over long periods of time. Now, let's learn about the natural factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem. Now, a disruption. What is a disruption? Let's first uh, discuss or define. Let's define what a disruption is. A disruption is something that interferes with the normal or orderly process of how an ecosystem functions. Now, natural disasters like floods, cyclones can cause a severe disruption to an ecosystem, but it normally recovers eventually, just like there have been floods in certain areas of the country in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and the ecosystems do recover eventually. Now, if the change occurs over long periods, for example, like climate change or global warming, the damage may not be reversible, like increase in temperatures. That damage to the ecosystem may be forever. It may not be possible to reverse it. Now, this can cause plants and animals to be permanently lost or to become extinct, and a different kind of ecosystem will form together. So we'll have a new ecosystem after the old ecosystem would have become extinct. So natural disasters such as floods and cyclones do severely affect ecosystems, and they do disrupt the balance in an ecosystem. Now, here are some examples of these natural factors. So we've got cyclones, and these cyclones can often lead to floods as well. So these extreme changes in patterns of weather and climate, such as floods, so some area may suddenly or with time start being affected by floods due to climate change. Now, floods can carry toxic materials such as pesticides, industrial waste, and sewage into ecosystems and can destroy habitat. Remember, when a place is flooded, water is coming from all directions. The water is coming from different places. As that water is flowing on the ground, it carries with it chemicals, toxic chemicals and toxic pesticides, taking them to wherever it's going to stop flowing or wherever it passes. Flooding also destroys the habitats of organisms, of plants and animals. It also destroys the habitats of plants and animals. Another natural factor that can affect the balance of an ecosystem is drought. Drought is the absence of rain. The absence of rain means there's no water for the animals. So that's an important resource. Water is a very important resource for animal survival. It means there's no water for the plants. The plants will not be able to photosynthesize and produce food. So drought does severely affect an ecosystem, right? And the most extreme drought, rain-dependent croplands in South Africa can be observed in the Northern Cape, the Northwest, and Limpopo. These are the provinces that are usually affected by drought when we talk about rain dependent croplands. Drought kills animals. As you can see in this picture here, there's some animals that have died due to lack of food, a very important resource. Lack of water, another very important resource. And then this man here has lost all his crops due to the lack of rain or the absence of rain. Right, now let's move on to our first activity. I'm going to read out the questions to you, then give you time to answer these questions. Question 1. A balanced ecosystem consists of blank. The place where an organism lives is known as blank. Name a natural factor which can cause an ecosystem to lose its habitats. And resources that restrict the growth of populations is known as blank. I'll give you 5 minutes to answer these questions. Then after 5 minutes, we'll do the solutions together. Don't forget to send in your solutions to our WhatsApp number. See you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. Now let's answer the questions together. Number 1. A balanced ecosystem consists of blank. It consists of only enough organisms that the food, water, and habitats can supply. Number 2. The place where an organism lives is known as a habitat. Name a natural factor which can cause an ecosystem to lose its habitat. If you wrote flooding or cyclones, I can take any of the answers. Number 4, resources that restrict the growth of populations is known as limiting factors. Limiting factors. Now I'm going to give you 2 minutes to copy down the corrections. So see you after 2 minutes. Welcome back. I'm sure you've copied down all of the corrections. Now let's move on to human factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem. The first one is poor farming practices. One example is overgrazing. This is when a farmer leads his livestock to graze in an area until all of the shrubs, trees, and grass are finished. So, overgrazing can lead to soil erosion. So, soil erosion is due to the loose soil after all the grass has been removed. So, this is a poor human practice that can lead to the imbalance in an ecosystem, which means other organisms that also rely on that grass that the cattle are grazing on won't have any food, and the soil is going to be eroded if there are some rains that come over. Now, overgrazing can be prevented by changing grazing spots. So if a farmer rotates his livestock around or changes paddocks over time, it can prevent overgrazing. Next, we have untreated sewage, which can cause severe water pollution. So if sewage is untreated and it is left to flow into the rivers, streams, lakes, and all the water sources, it can cause what is called water pollution. And water pollution is very poisonous. One, to the aquatic animals. Two, to the land animals, the terrestrial animals that feed on, that drink the water. Now, this can also spread disease. It can also spread disease to humans, animals, and aquatic animals. So what can you do? What part can you play? So make sure you don't throw harmful chemicals down the drain at home or down into rivers, streams. So let's try and be cautious and preserve our ecosystems. Let's try and be cautious and preserve our ecosystems. Now, another way that humans can disrupt the balance in an ecosystem is burning fossil fuels. Burning of the fossil fuels, it releases poisonous gases into the atmosphere. These harmful these harmful chemicals in the air can cause a whole range of allergic and degenerative lung diseases, as well as cardiovascular disease and many cancers. So air pollution is harmful to the living organisms. This includes animals, humans as well. Now, air pollution can also cause one more thing. It can cause what is called acid rain. Acid rain destroys forests and poisons lake. It destroys forests and poisons lake. What can we do? What can we do? We need to use more environmental friendly sources of fuels, which is solar energy. That's one example that we can use. Okay, here's another factor, the use of pesticides. The use of pesticides, many people use pesticides in their gardens to prevent their crops from being devoured by pests. We use pesticides in the house when there's that noisy mosquito that will be disrupting us. So the use of pesticide is dangerous to birds and insects. It's dangerous to bird and insect population as well. These pests that we're trying to get rid of, they become resistant to pesticides, which can often lead to an increase in their population growth and an imbalance in the ecosystem. All right, so what can we do? Don't use products that cause pollution and rather support companies to develop cleaner technologies. So, next time you want to use a pesticide, think twice. Think how you can get rid of the pest without using a pesticide. Another factor is cutting down trees. Cutting down trees destroys animal habitats. And what else does it do? Remember, the trees that photosynthesize, the leaves of the trees, they make use of the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, thereby reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that exists in the atmosphere. So now cutting down trees will end up with high carbon dioxide levels within the atmosphere. So an increase in carbon dioxide levels in an atmosphere will contribute to global warming. So next time you feel like cutting down a tree, think twice. All right, here's another factor, poaching. We said poaching is the illegal removal of plants and animals from their natural environment. What else does poaching do? Poaching leads to a decrease in a species and a decrease to biodiversity. It leads to the extinction of species. Now let's talk about one example, South African rhino poaching. I've got a picture here, or rather I've got a graph that shows the number of rhinos that were poached between 2007 to 2018. If you look, there has been an increase. There was a sharp increase from 2007 all the way to 2014. In 2007, 13 rhinos were recorded to be poached, and in 2014, the highest number of rhinos ever to be poached within this time period was 1,215 rhinos. So that is a lot of rhinos that were poached, a species that was reduced from an ecosystem. Reduction of a species from an ecosystem causes an imbalance because these organisms, they interact within that ecosystem. They also depend on each other. They also depend on each other in that particular ecosystem. So removing one or removing an entire population will definitely cause an imbalance. Right, there has been decrease. The graph also shows a decrease in number of rhinos that were poached from 2015 to 2018 to 2018, and then 2018 769 rhinos were poached. 769 rhinos were poached. All right, now let's move on to our second activity. This activity involves a table. Now here are the instructions. Copy the table indicated below and complete it by filling in the following. Write down the effect, which is the consequence, of this issue on the ecosystem or on humans, and write down a possible solution or a simple action that you can take to help. So there are three columns in this table. There's environmental issue, there's consequence, and there's action. Under environmental issue, we've got inappropriate waste disposal, which is air pollution, inappropriate waste disposal, again, water pollution, and then inappropriate waste disposal, again, landfills and littering, and then we've got carbon emissions and climate change. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this and see you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8 learners. Now let's answer the questions together. So let's start off with the first environmental issue, which is inappropriate waste disposal, in particular, air pollution. So what is the consequence of air pollution? Right, with air pollution, harmful chemicals in the air cause a whole range of allergic and degenerative lung diseases, so that you can put that as one, as well as cardiovascular disease and many cancers. Two, an option you could have written is air pollution can also cause acid rain, and this is poisonous to forests and lakes, rivers, or marine ecosystems. What can we do? What can we do, or what action can be taken? Right, we can support companies that produce cleaner production methods which don't cause air pollution, and they don't make use or they don't distribute products that cause air pollution. And then next we have water pollution. It's also under inappropriate waste disposal. What is the consequence of inappropriate waste disposal, in particular water pollution? Water pollution can be caused by factories or farms by allowing their waste to run off into the streams or water sources. It can also be caused by accumulation of many people discarding their waste into rivers. So don't throw away your waste into rivers, streams, and dams. It causes water pollution, and this can spread diseases and poison terrestrial animals as well as aquatic animals, and us as well, because we need the water. What can we do? What action can we take? Make sure you don't throw harmful chemicals down the drain when you're cleaning at home. Don't throw them down the drain, and don't throw them into rivers, don't throw them into streams. And make sure you support companies that dispose their waste in a responsible way. Now, another part of inappropriate waste disposal, landfills and littering. So if you keep on throwing your rubbish at one particular point that isn't coded as a dumping point, what is going to happen? The litter is going to build up. So that is the consequence of littering. The litter builds up and can take thousands of years to degrade. Some of these products that we use on a daily basis or we use at home are not biodegradable. Decomposers are unable to break them down. The decomposers are not able to break them down and recycle the nutrients back into the ecosystem. So what will happen? They will take years and years to be broken down, or the litter is going to build up. It's going to build up and form towers, piles and piles and piles. Now, due to inappropriate waste disposal, plastic is ending up in the ocean and in many habitats of animals. And some animals mistake them for food, and they end up eating them and choking and often dying. So that is the consequence of inappropriate waste disposal, littering. Throw your rubbish in the bin. So what can we do? What can we do to reduce or to stop this type of waste disposal? Right, you reduce, reuse, and recycle whenever it is possible. Don't throw litter onto the ground, and look after your belongings so that they last longer. So keep reusing them. Take care of them well so that you can reuse them. If you reuse them, they last longer, and which means you are going to avoid going to buy something new, because this new thing is going to come with packaging. And make sure when you buy, you don't often buy packaging. That paper bag that you often get at the shop, carry paper bags from home. Don't buy a new paper bag every time you go to the shop. Next, we have carbon emissions and climate change. Carbon emissions and climate change. So what is the consequence of carbon emissions and climate change? Right. So we know that most carbon emissions are as a result of excessive burning of fossil fuels. And what is this? This is a type of air pollution that contributes to global warming. So global warming is a consequence of carbon emissions. It is a serious consequence of carbon emissions. Right, global warming and climate change, these two are a consequence of carbon emissions. Now, climate change has a huge effect on the habitats of animals because often plants and animals are unable to adapt fast to the change in their habitats. Imagine if there's a flood and the flood comes and destroys or washes away their habitat. Animals will take time. They will take time to adapt to the new setting or to adapt to a new habitat or to adapt to that destroyed habitat. And this is too fast. It happens too fast. It often happens too fast for the animal to adapt. And the sad thing is that this may result in many animals or many species becoming extinct because of the destroying or disruption of their habitats. Now, what can we do? What can we do, or what action can we take? Now, there's so many things you can do. You can start off by the way you live your life at home. Try to limit your use of electricity. Switch off the light when you're not in that particular room. If you're not using the room, switch the lights off. If it's during the day, switch the lights off. Use the free light that comes from the sun. Instead of using a heater during the cold winter months, try putting on more clothes. Add more clothes and wear warm clothes. Right, turn off the geyser for some hours of the day so you can switch it on in the morning and switch it off later in the day when no one needs to take a bath. And don't overfill the kettle. If you overfill the kettle, it will take too long for it to boil the water. If you need just 1 cup of tea, just fill it at its minimum. That will be enough. So that's you using less electricity. Share lifts, which means you carpool, you share lifts. If your neighbor has a car and you're going in the same direction, why not just share a lift? This week you use your neighbor's car, next week the neighbor uses your car. And if ever you can, walk. If wherever you're going is close, just take a walk and use less plastic. All right, grade 8. Now we are done with our revision of our activities. Now, before we wrap up our lesson, I'd like to say thank you to Soshangube SOS for sending in your responses to the different activities that you were doing and the questions that you also sent to us. Thank you so much, Soshangube SOS. Now, let's wrap up our lesson. What did we learn today? Today we learned about the factors that affect the balance in the ecosystem. Right, so the balance in an ecosystem is affected by the availability of food, water, light, and shelter. So these factors affect the balance in an ecosystem. Now, these are the natural, the factors that disrupt the balance in an ecosystem. Now, one of them is natural factors. We learned that cyclones, droughts, and floods, they often cause an imbalance in an ecosystem, one, by destroying the habitat of the living organisms that are there in the ecosystem, or a drought can cause the absence of a food source for different animals. And then we also learned about the human factors that cause an imbalance balance in an ecosystem. Poor farming practices, we gave an example of overgrazing, which means all the grass in a particular ecosystem will be finished. This will later on cause soil erosion. What can we do about it? What we can do is we can reduce the number of animals that are grazing in that area, or use a rotational methods where animals graze in different paddocks at different times. We also learned about dumping untreated sewage waste as one of the factors, the human factors that disrupt the balance of an ecosystem. Now, dumping untreated sewage waste poisons our water sources. It also poisons and kills all the plants and animals that rely on that particular water source. We also learned about releasing toxic chemicals into rivers and streams. They also poison aquatic animals, and they also poison land animals as well. We also learned about burning fossil fuels, how that increases the levels of carbon dioxide or carbon emissions into our atmospheres, causing allergic reactions and different kinds of diseases to the living organisms as well as humans that live in that particular area. We also learned about the use of pesticides, how pests become resistant, and how pesticides also poison birds and different plants in that particular ecosystem where the pesticide is being used. Then we also learned about the deforestation. Deforestation is when we have a lot of trees being cut down and no trees being planted. Deforestation destroys the habitats of animals, and animals take a long time to adapt to new areas where their habitats have been destroyed. We also learned about poaching, how poaching can lead to the extinction of our precious living organisms, causing an imbalance in an ecosystem. All right, grade 8. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this lesson. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.